It appears that your environment suit fused with your body, but we're going to help you, Victor.
Am I crazy? Or is this really good?
The Fantastic Four franchise has never quite found a comfortable space within cinema. There have been 4 live-action adaptations and an unauthorized low-budget musical.
I don't want to be invisible. I don't want to be invisible anymore.
The latest effort had the potential to be fantastic, but ended up being an unremarkable wreck. When I first started putting this together, I thought the video would just be an exploration of how Fant4stic was a bad adaptation and a poorly executed film. But as I looked into what was fundamentally wrong with the movie, and the reasons why it was greenlit, which was to retain licensing rights, I found a history of troubling repetitive behavior, which explained why certain decisions were made behind the scenes, and how they ended up having disastrous effects on the film's structure. In this 3-part video, we're going to explore how the fight to retain intellectual property has affected each Fantastic Four film. We're then going to look at Fant4stic's particularly chaotic production. And then finally, we're going to dive into the film itself, breaking down what happens and looking at its structural problems.
Oh, by the way, that laser you saw, it's finished now. Allow me to demonstrate its purpose.
The first attempt to make a Fantastic Four film came all the way back in 1983, when German producer Bernd Eichinger met with Stan Lee at his home and asked if he could purchase the rights to make a film adaptation. Despite an agreement being reached, the $250,000 license wouldn't arrive until 1986. The movie then laboured in production hell until the early 90s. With the license set to expire on December 31st, 1992, the producer was struggling to find financial backing for his planned $40 million project, and to make matters worse, Marvel refused to give Bernd an extension. Realizing that all he needed to do to renew the rights and keep hold of the license was to start production for the movie at least a day before the license expiration date, Bernd teamed up with B-movie specialist Roger Corman, and the pair started production for their untitled Fantastic Four movie on December 28th, 1992. Made on a relatively small budget of $1 million provided by Bernd's production company, Constantin Film, with little care, thought or preparation, the end result was a disaster. Days before the premiere, the release was halted. The production company then confiscated the negatives for the film and then sent out cease and desist to the cast and crew, preventing them from talking about it. What happened? It's hard to say with 100% certainty for obvious legal reasons, but the consensus since has been that the film was made not as an artistic venture, but as an ashcan copy, a bid for Bernd to retain the movie rights. Why this is so important for us is that it appears that history is Victor Von doomed to repeat itself.
Victor, the board is drawing the destroyer here! You have to give it up!
You know, I've never been the giving type, Reed.
With Constantin Film still in control of the movie rights and 20th Century Fox now knocking on their door wanting to make their own adaptation, Bernd sub-licensed the film rights to Fox, who were then placed on the clock to make a film quickly to make sure that the rights were retained. The pittance they paid in relation to the true value of the characters wasn't lost on executives, and by the turn of the new century, they were smiling with glee at the prospect of bank balances being flooded as the genre exploded. The commercial success of the first 2 X-Men films, the rights of which were also purchased by Fox, hence the ridiculous number of X-Men movies that we've had since, and the success of the 2005 Fantastic Four movie solidified this in their minds.
The cloud has fundamentally altered our DNA.
Cool!
Although I loved the ensemble cast and the film's overall cheesiness, which reflected the tone of the comics well, the film was critically derided.
Where's Reed?
Back here.
Then in 2007 came its sequel, Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer, which extended Bernd's hold over the licensing, and Fox Studios' sub-license once again. Despite also turning a profit, the rushed film was pretty disappointing, especially its ending with what the studio thought was a great interpretation of Galactus. Enter Fant4stic, the 2015 reboot, which, like every other Fantastic Four movie before it, exists not as a legitimate creative endeavour, but as a commercially driven attempt to retain intellectual property. Fox's bid to extend their lease on the license for the Fantastic Four is even a running joke in Arrested Development, with one of the show's characters, Tobias, attempting to put on a Fantastic Four musical, only to be served multiple cease and desists. In one of the episodes, filmed 2 years prior to the release of Fant4stic, Josh Trank himself appears as someone dispatched by Fox to stop Tobias's production.
Who are you supposed to be?
Oh, I'm the Thing from Fantastic Four.
You've been served. Someone should remake that movie.
That Trank would go on to direct an adaptation of the film itself, and then be stopped as he was in the final stages of production, just as Tobias was, is as ironic as it is hilarious. While the film doesn't quite deserve all the crap it gets from comic book fans and critics, there isn't much that can redeem it from the cinematic hell reserved for abject failures like Battlefield Earth. The issues with Fant4stic started way before anybody even saw it, with stories of egotistical and difficult direction by Trank, unhappy stars, meddling studios, and budgetary problems making headlines. The negative buzz in the build-up to the film's release was palpable, and expectations from even the most ardent Fantastic Four fans were low. The end result is a train wreck of infuriating ideas lacking structure, substance, and a fundamental understanding of who the Fantastic Four were. Trank's determination to veer from the source material and darken the tone is evident in the first half, and although this wasn't the Fantastic Four movie we'd expected, those sections were easily the most interesting and entertaining parts of the movie. The problem is that this vision isn't sustained, and after the first half, we abruptly go from Trank's Fantastic Four to Fox Studios' Fant4stic. There's no doubt that Josh Trank is a competent director, and you can understand why Fox attached him to the untitled Fantastic Four project in July of 2012. His low-budget feature chronicle about a group of guys acquiring incredible power was a commercial and critical success, and also had similarities to the Fantastic Four origin story. But though he picked the project up, what Fox didn't realize is that he actually hated the superhero genre, and had no intention of being faithful to the source material, and it shows. As it says in their name, the Fantastic Four are supposed to be fantastic, yet the film lacked the joy and optimism synonymous with the group, and instead subverts the characters into aimless and dull versions of their comic book counterparts.
It modulates the frequency of the matter to another location and it brings it back again. It's a teleport.
Shooting began in May of 2014 and lasted 72 days, and according to sources, Trank was driven to breaking point during this time. Sadly, his dog passed away during production, online criticism was heated over his casting choices, Fox delayed casting and left script approval to the last minute, slashed the film's budget, and forced in many last-minute changes before principal photography had even commenced. But once the shoot began, Trank admitted the studio left him to his own devices. It's not until they saw the first rough cut that Fox executives were surprised to see the film was very dark, and that the characters were very unlike the heroes from the comics it was based on. The studio then hijacked the editing room and kicked the director out, hoping that they could salvage something. Ultimately dissatisfied with the direction Trank had taken the film, Fox executives mandated reshoots which took place in January of 2015, without the director. These weren't your typical reshoots and pickups to collect missed material or correct previous wrongs though. No, the producers rewrote large portions of Trank's original script and gave the film an entirely different second half. With this in mind, the disjointed nature of the film, the lack of structure or character development, and the inconsistent tone all begin to make sense as we're watching two different stories mashed together instead of one consistent vision. Not only did the massive reshoots create a fractured film with two halves, but the tumultuous production caused the film to suffer from a variety of continuity errors that are occasionally hilarious but mostly just jarring. For a film peppered with reshoots, it's perhaps understandable, but with the number of issues in Fant4stic, you have to wonder if the production team were given enough time to keep up with the number of changes that were being made, or whether they really gave a crap by the end. Amongst the many failures are Sue's constantly changing hairstyles and shades of blonde that change depending on the angle she's in. Reed's facial hair is also comical, disappearing and reappearing depending on the room he's in. Hell, there are so many continuity issues in the film, such as appearing and disappearing nosebleeds, equations that magically erase themselves from whiteboards, to pancakes that change position, that an entire video could be dedicated to this alone. In a since-deleted tweet just before the film's release, Trank said, "A year ago I had a fantastic version of this, and it would have received great reviews. You'll probably never see it. That's reality though." While this paints Trank as a misunderstood director, strong-armed by the studio, away from a grand vision which would have been far superior to the film's final form, there is another story here, one that isn't as simple as an artist being bullied by a production company. Instead, many who worked on Trank's set during the original shoot of the film reported some serious problems with how he dealt with his frustrations, with claims that Trank often showed up late to set or didn't show up at all, that he was often intoxicated, and that he treated everyone terribly. And if all accounts are to be believed, he'd done so much damage to the home rented for him by the studio that Fox CEO Jim Giannopoulos came to Baton Rouge and personally apologized to the owners. While this account of Trank's actions comes from a bit of hearsay, actress Kate Mara simply described her experience on the set of the film as horrible. What we do know for sure is that Trank was obviously not the right person for this project. He lacked the enthusiasm and knowledge about the Fantastic Four to be able to make an entertaining and faithful adaptation. Fox's objectives to retain the license and turn a profit is apparent. They ultimately hired a self-confessed comic book hater to direct a comic book film, and only started caring when they realized the direction he'd taken the film had the potential to hurt their bottom line. Ultimately, it's unclear whether Trank's film would have been a better adaptation of the Fantastic Four than Fant4stic was, but I think it at least would have been structurally sound and coherent. One of the biggest criticisms labelled at Fant4stic is that it's a bleak and joyless experience, but also one that lacks any semblance of structured storytelling. In the comics, the Fantastic Four family are a mismatched collection of wacky heroes who go on fun adventures together. They revel in their endeavours and are regarded by all Marvel heroes as the most reliable and optimistic group around, but by comparison, the characters in the film outwardly appear to hate their existence. To top it all off, the actors playing the quartet look like they're enjoying the experience just as much as their on-screen personas. They grunt and grumble their way woodenly through the film's dialogue, looking to all intents and purposes like they hate every part of the experience. As the film opens, we're graced with a pretty promising start. The introduction does a great job of setting up Reed and Ben's friendship. It also establishes their goals and motivations. Reed is ridiculously intelligent, he believes he can master teleportation, among other things, and is motivated by curiosity. Ben, on the other hand, isn't as bright but wants to help out, motivated by the sense of purpose Reed's mission gives him. They band together and build the prototype of the teleporter, which becomes central to the entire narrative. Considering they made the early development of Ben and Reed's relationship integral to the plot, you'd think that they would at least go through Susan and Johnny's relationship as well. After all, they're the Fantastic Four, not the dynamic duo, but Johnny is forced to take a back seat in the story, while Susan is often invisible.
It's a teleporter.
A teleporter.
Reed's science teacher berates the boy when he explains that he's in the process of building a teleportation device, and threatens to fail him if he doesn't aim lower in life, because that makes sense. With the help of Ben, Reed manages to find the parts he needs to operate his prototype, and teleports a toy car over to what he believes is another part of the planet, but is actually another dimension, before teleporting rocks from that dimension back to Earth. But after we jump 7 years ahead to their school science fair, we have two completely different characters, and their sense of curiosity and wonder from the opening sequence is now replaced by indifference and arrogance. For some reason, Jamie Bell and Miles Teller go out of their way to make Ben and Reed look as miserable as possible. Having said that, to be fair, nobody else looks particularly happy in this film either.
Shall I alert the fire department? What is this?
This is a cymatic matter shuttle.
The characters are also supposed to be in high school, but the pair look as though they're in their late 20s, because they were during filming. Despite failing his science project due to his teacher's inability to distinguish science from magic, after successfully demonstrating his teleportation device, Reed is picked up by Franklin Storm and his company to continue his work. Following the introduction of Franklin's biological son Johnny, his adopted daughter Susan, and his troubled star pupil Victor Von Doom, we're treated to a ridiculously long section of the film where Reed and the others start building a full-scale model. Seriously, a third of the movie is the group building this machine, with boring dialogue and intense stares from the actors sprinkled in. While the machine is being built, Ben sulks his way through the story looking miserable. Reed is often inconsiderate and selfish.
Use this for 1 second, but I'll get it back, I promise. The buttons, it's delicate. You can't smash it.
You're a dick.
Johnny reckons with his past, Susan spends most of her time listening to music, while Victor gets jealous that Reed and Susan are getting along. The Fantastic Four is supposed to represent the marrying of two families, but there's no foundation built here. We're supposed to believe that Sue and Reed are developing romantic feelings towards each other, but there's little evidence that they like each other, or any of the other characters for the vast majority of the film. Once a teleportation device is active, government agents funding the project inform the group that the device would be passed on to NASA for human trials. Unhappy about this, the boys call Ben and force him to join them on a secret mission to the other dimension. They also leave Susan behind, despite her being more integral to the mission than Ben. The gang arrive on Planet Zero, and after coming into contact with the cosmic force, Johnny, Reed and Ben scramble back to the teleportation device and are thrust back to Earth, leaving Victor to suffer an unknown fate. Susan, who is unfortunately made redundant for large parts of this film, somehow also becomes affected by cosmic energy when they return. For a moment, we see the group try and process the new changes to their bodies while under the constant supervision of the military. Their pain and struggle to adapt is hinted, and just as we're approaching the most interesting part of the movie, instead of exploring how the gang adapt, rebel against, and finally accept their new powers, Reed escapes the military facility containing them, and we abruptly jump forward 1 year from Trank's Fant4stic 4 film to Fant4stic, a second half composed out of scenes that Fox completely rewrote and reshot.
In terms of potential, you already know what he's accomplished in the field.
Now, instead of receiving information about the narrative and our main characters from our main characters, we're literally sat down in a board meeting and one of the most throwaway characters, who's literally killed a few scenes later, explains to us who our characters have become, what their powers were, and what has happened over the past year. In short, instead of showing us the film's exposition through action and character-driven dialogue, or getting Reed, Ben, Johnny or Susan to tell us what they're thinking and feeling, as we'd been privy to for the previous 55 minutes, we're literally sat down and spoon-fed information by a proxy character. For 55 minutes, over half of the film, we're being told a story in one way, and then at the drop of a hat, the narrative changes pace, and we're sent in a whole new direction. And unfortunately, this new turn becomes the norm for the rest of the film, completely obliterating any promise that the first half had shown. Because of this structural hiccup, we lose the second act of the film, the act where our characters are supposed to overcome the obstacles that will transform them into heroes. In a traditional 3-act structure, the first act contains a setup. We get the beginning, the inciting incident, and the climax of Act 1. The second act is the meat of the story, featuring the main confrontation. We get the rising action, propelling our characters forward. Our heroes have a number of obstacles to overcome. The rising action continues until a crisis is reached, and then we have the climax of Act 2. And finally, the third act is where we have the resolution. The conflict is resolved. Our characters don't need to win, they can lose. They just need to have grown and be changed by the experience. In Fant4stic, we get the setup in the first act, with Reed building the teleportation device, but we're stuck here for the first half of the film, and instead of them getting their powers at the climax of Act 1, which is what happens in the 2005 adaptation, the group don't go to Planet Zero to the midpoint of the movie. This means that when our characters are supposed to be dealing with the main confrontation, they are just coming into contact with the inciting incident. We're already pretty behind by this stage, and to make up for lost time, the film ignores the fundamentals of character and story development by cramming the second and third acts into the final 15 minutes of the film. Leaping ahead in time like this, immediately after a pivotal point for our main characters, and then fundamentally changing the tone and style to this extent, means that we miss their key moment of change in identity, and are left with two completely different films that have been stitched together. We go from knowing them as set people to knowing them as heroes and villains. The transformation from normal to superhuman is sidelined, along with the complex changes that come along with that. How were their personalities affected? How did they deal with this? Evidently, it doesn't matter. These questions and more go unanswered in arguably one of the most fundamental discussions in superhero fiction, that of personal identity in the face of acquiring tremendous power. As horribly overquoted as it is, Spider-Man touches some deep themes with the line,
"With great power comes great responsibility."
The reason this is reinforced in most superhero stories is that the acceptance of this responsibility and the duty to exercise that power for good is when our characters truly start becoming superheroes. Most stories do this in different ways, but the main point is that the process of becoming a superhero or supervillain doesn't happen instantly, it takes time. The characters have to be tested before they can figure out who they're going to be, but none of that happens in Fant4stic. Compare that to the 2005 adaptation of Fant4stic 4, which not only captured the personalities of the characters well, but also followed the basic rules of storytelling. In it, our four heroes and Victor encounter the inciting incident, a cosmic event while conducting research in space, and gain their powers at the end of the first act. The second act sees them coming to grips with the new changes to their bodies and overcoming a number of obstacles. Ben's fiancée leaves him once she sees what he looks like, but he overcomes this by finding someone that accepts him for who he is inside. Victor has to contend with being strong-armed out of his own company, setting him on the path to becoming a villain. Susan is traumatized to use her powers, fearing that she'll lose control and be naked in public again. Johnny embraces the new powers and tries to exploit their gifts for financial gain, and Reed does the best he can to reverse the effects of the cosmic radiation, while constantly butting heads with Victor along the way. As the action rises, they overcome their individual obstacles and reach their final confrontation with Doom. The Fant4stic 4 accept and embrace their powers, and in the third act defeat Doom by banding together.
You are Trouble.
Trouble is my middle name.
Oh, you're hot.
Why, thank you, so are you. And I'm not afraid to cry.
No, I mean you feel a little feverish.
Say what you want about some of the corny jokes in the film, but the screenwriters and the director, whose name is seriously Tim Story, all understood story structure and what the Fantastic Four were about. All things aside, it's safe to say that the final third of Fant4stic is where the real problems become apparent. Reed is captured by the government and brought in to help them head back to Planet Zero, where they find a heavily disfigured Victor and bring him home. As you watch the genius from the comics that spent his life acquiring power so that he could defend his kingdom of Latveria, and see him waking up looking like a strange hybrid of a medical droid from Star Wars and a blank-faced Twiki from Buck Rogers, the last vestiges of goodwill are torn out of you. And unlike the original Doom, who uses intelligence and cunning, this guy is handed godly power on a silver platter. To make it even worse, as a sugar packet solution to removing Victor's main objective of acquiring power in the comics, they turn him into a monster with a generic desire to destroy the world. This is how we left the character.
Help me! Victor! Victor! No!
And this is how he next appears.
If this world must die, so that mine may live, so be it.
What happened in between? We don't understand his motivation because he and the second act are missing for most of the movie. The heroes haven't overcome any personal obstacles, and due to Victor's absence for most of the second half of the film, the Fantastic Four have no antagonistic force to contend with, and no source of conflict until the final 10 minutes of the movie. The film basically ends just as it was structurally reaching the crisis of its second act. The final confrontation pales in comparison to what we've seen in previous films, and Doom's destruction via a punch from Ben Grimm is about as anticlimactic as you can get. Even with Doom defeated and the world saved, and the only example of teamwork we see in the entire narrative, our heroes had spent most of their powered up time alone. Johnny was shooting down drones, Ben was working as a human tank for the military, Reed was trying to fix himself, and Susan was training by herself. Because of this, they all still feel very distant from each other. The final scene, which has them awkwardly standing in a line one step apart from each other, looking around and fielding ideas for a name, highlights this distance perfectly.
Which reminds me, I think that the four of us should have a name.
Why would we need a name?
Because we're a team now, and there's four of us.
Compare the enthusiasm in the name reveal and the sense of camaraderie here to that of the characters in the 2005 adaptation.
One of the four stretched to an amazing length.
That's what they're calling it. The Fantastic Four.
Man, I love this job.
You're supposed to end the film on a high note and have the audience invested enough that they're eager to come back, but it's hard when it feels like we're watching four terrific actors that hate their jobs and have just been asked to work overtime without pay. The shenanigans which led to Fant4stic's failure clearly weren't pretty. Trank has publicly disowned the film, even lamenting that he's let Stan Lee down. I'm not here to point fingers. It really doesn't matter if it was the studio, the director, the producers, or all of the above that let the project down. At the end of the day, nothing will change the fact that Fant4stic is a poorly directed, joyless, and horribly structured bore fest.